We saw the play in previews, which is when you're supposed to get the kinks out. Well, in the climactic scene, which you didn't see a clip from tonight, after the verdict has been rendered, the lead defendant, Judge Yanning, asks for an opportunity to meet with the American judge, Judge Haywood, before he returns to the United States. A lawyer-to-lawyer opportunity to express his respect. And so in this play, Maximilian Schell, playing the lead defendant, is speaking to whoever the actor was playing the American judge. And the climactic line in that scene is an apology, in a sense, where the defendant is saying, Judge Haywood, I never thought it would come to this. But in this preview, proving that even Oscar winners and geniuses are human, Maximilian Schell blew his line. Instead of saying, Judge Haywood, I never thought it would come to this, he said, Herr Yanning. And then he froze. And 5 painful seconds passed because, of course, he was playing the role of Herr Yanning and was using the wrong name. And then he said, Judge Haywood, and sort of stumbled through the rest of the scene. And I realized after a couple of minutes that I think I saw not only a flub by an actor, but the imprint on a young man 40 years later of playing this incredibly powerful role. Even with all the rehearsal and study and skill and preparation, he couldn't make the switch. He was still where he'd been planted in the late 1950s Playhouse version and in the 1960s movie version, addressing Herr Yanning as his lawyer. And in a sense, I think it is that kind of movie. It will burn into you and strike you if you give it that chance. But it needs to be a time when it matters. Because what was interesting is that having seen that preview, within 2 weeks, I was too late if I wanted to go back again. It closed. It bombed. It drew no audience, some negative reviews in the previews, and it never made it to a full run, much less any kind of life. And that was February 2001. That was about 3 miles north of the World Trade Center. And Nuremberg and international law and global criminality, I think, to the American theater market seemed utterly, historically distant and irrelevant. And of course, that's just timing and unfortunate for the investors. I think if this play had been ready to go in October of 2001 or at some later point since then, the market would have responded differently because it matters. But you have to see it, you have to evaluate it, you have to decide for yourself what you think it means. I was struck by one of Mr. Mann's comments. He quoted Max Lerner, a great writer and thinker and constitutional scholar, who referred to the play, as Abby Mann just reported it, as a film that shouldn't be shown. It would hurt our country. And it echoed for me a comment that I've read in another version of a 1960s perspective. Max Lerner was a dear close friend of Justice William O. Douglas, a notable antagonist of Robert Jackson, a notable critic of Nuremberg. I suspect some of that think is in the Lerner comment. It's also reflected in a diary entry that Justice Hugo Black's wife jotted in the 1960s, another Jackson colleague and perhaps not a Nuremberg admirer. And Elizabeth Black wrote in her diary that night, Hugo and I watched Judgment at Nuremberg. He thinks it's a piece of propaganda for the prosecutors. Well, in a sense, that's the argument that Maximilian Schell's defense lawyer character makes in the movie. You too. This defendant is not alone. Everybody shares the blame. Don't act so high and mighty and holy about it. And the response, delivered by Spencer Tracy, delivered by Robert Jackson, delivered by Whitney Harris, delivered by everyone who was a part of the Nuremberg Project, is in the dock at this moment in a fair process. What we are adjudicating is your conduct. And any effort like this is imperfect. It's partial. It's got a starting point. It perhaps should go further. But the movie gives you a chance to evaluate what was done, where it was done, how it was done, and I think powerfully communicates to our time. It, however, is not a movie about Robert Jackson. There's nobody in that film that plays the Jackson role. It's not the Jackson International Trial. It's not even Jackson's successor, Telford Taylor, who was the chief American prosecutor for those subsequent American cases, including the Justice case, who's portrayed in that movie. The lead prosecutor in the Justice case is Charles La Follette. And so the great role of Richard Widmark as the lead prosecutor is that relatively forgotten lawyer who was deep in the run of Nuremberg cases at a time, 1947, 1948, when the world's interest and agenda was clearly shifting from accountability for the past to alliances and Cold War and looking forward to an alliance with Germany for the future. But that's only technically right, because in this story of a later trial prosecuted by La Follette, working for Taylor, when Jackson is back on the Supreme Court, you actually do get Jackson. You actually do get the IMT trial. You actually do get Whitney Harris and everything that they were a part of. Because what Abby Mann did, quite obviously to another person who's in the business, is attack Nuremberg like a scholar. He clearly did a voluminous amount of research. He clearly digested an enormous amount of material. And frankly, part of what he harvested and plugged into his version of the Justice case was a lot of the substance and the vision and literally the language of the IMT case and Robert Jackson as the American chief counsel in that prosecution. A clip we saw tonight gives you one taste of it. The complaining party at the bar of this court is civilization itself. I've seen the pad and the yellow page on which those words were written, first, fresh, from the brain, life, perspective, and intellect of their author, Robert H. Jackson. And so in a completing of the circle and embracing all of Nuremberg, Abby Mann and everyone part of it deserves credit for being part of delivering this important message at a hard time and making it available to later times like our own, and frankly for reaching back for some of the best that was part of Nuremberg from the IMT phase going forward. Thank you very much.
Can you imagine what he would have done if he'd had some time to think about it? I told him to do this 10 minutes before we got started.